Yes, Jesus Christ is alive. He rose from the dead, and that day, that Easter Sunday morning, that first Easter, when Mary and Mary Magdalene and Salome went to the grave expecting to anoint a dead body, they saw the angel sitting there. And they said, "Where is Jesus?" The angel said, "He is not here, he is risen." I submit to you tonight that that's the greatest news the world has ever heard. He is not here. He has conquered the grave. He's alive. And ladies and gentlemen, I believe that there's more proof that Jesus Christ rose from the dead than almost any other fact in Roman history. I don't believe there's a fact in ancient history today so well proven as the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But even if there was no proof, no historical proof, no scientific proof, and there is, I would still believe it, because I believe this book is God's inspired word. And the whole early church went up and down the country preaching the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That was the thing that shook the Roman Empire. That a man had risen from the dead, that he was alive, that death could not hold him. Christ is alive. He's a living Savior.
Well, good morning, church. How are we doing today? I am so glad to be with you. My name is Dan. If you don't know me, I'm one of the pastors here at Illuminate. And today, I get the privilege of sharing with you just a little bit about Easter and how it still impacts our lives 2,000 years after the resurrection of Jesus. But before we get into all that, I want to start with this. Have you ever noticed how music can change everything? Right? Like not just your mood, but your entire moment. You can be having the most ordinary day. You can be driving down the road, grabbing coffee, doing nothing special, and then a song comes on, and suddenly you're not here anymore. You're somewhere else. A song comes on and you're back in high school, right? You're walking through the hallway. You're trying to act cooler than you actually were. Right? A song plays and you're standing at a wedding again. You're remembering the joy, the hope, the emotion. A song plays and you're in the car on a summer night. Windows are down. You're laughing with friends. You're feeling like life is just wide open. A song plays and you remember loss. Suddenly the moment gets heavy and you're right back there all over again. You see, music doesn't just fill space, it frames moments. And so here's what I want to say. There is a soundtrack to our lives. And that soundtrack shapes how we experience life. And you see, I learned that really early because I was a teenager in the late 90s and the early 2000s, which means I grew up in the golden era of mixtapes. You see, and if you were a love-struck teenager in that age, you didn't just listen to music, you weaponized it. You built entire emotional strategies with it. And so I can distinctly remember a young, awkward, hopelessly romantic, love-struck teenage Dan. That picture just keeps cropping up. Right? Sitting in his bedroom, convinced that if I could just create the right soundtrack, I wouldn't have to say to a girl what I was too nervous to say out loud. Because listen, I wasn't smooth. I didn't have game. I wasn't confident walking up to any girl and saying how I felt. No, I was going to let bands like Matchbox 20 and Third Eye Blind and Taking Back Sunday do the emotional heavy lifting for me. And so there I am, I'm sitting on the floor and there's CD cases everywhere and I'm flipping through them like I am building the greatest playlist of all time, carefully curating the perfect soundtrack because every song matters and every song is intentional. Every song is basically just saying, hey, pretty girl, I hope you like me because I really, really like you. And here's the thing, you had to get the order right because the order mattered just as much as the songs. You couldn't just jump right into the emotional stuff. You had to ease into it. So you start with something cool, something that makes you seem deep, but not too obvious. Closing Time by Semisonic. Thoughtful, reflective, sending the message that, hey, we both know it's over with the guy you're dating now. After all, don't you know that every new beginning starts with some other beginning's end? And then you shift into something a little bit more emotional, like Truly Madly Deeply by Savage Garden, which at 15 years old feels incredibly profound. Even though my entire dating experience up to that point was a couple of awkward youth group hangouts and one very uncomfortable movie theater outing where neither of us knew whether we were supposed to talk or just stare straight ahead. And then you move into I Don't Want to Miss a Thing by Aerosmith. Because nothing says subtle teenage feelings like a song that is literally written about world-ending love. Then you throw in Kiss Me by Sixpence None the Richer. You see, now we're painting a mental picture, right? We're romantic, we're hopeful. The imaginary relationship that only existed in my head is going on at this point. And then you hit the emotional centerpiece right in the middle, Hands Down by Dashboard Confessional. Because nothing says emotional intensity like handing someone a song that basically declared meeting them was the best moment in your entire life. Even though the biggest moment we'd shared so far was probably talking 5 minutes after youth group. And then you follow it up with something that feels deep and dramatic, Collide by Howie Day. And finally, you choose some hopeful, meaningful, something like Iris by the Goo Goo Dolls. Because at that point, you're just all in emotionally. There's no turning back now. And I remember finishing this masterpiece, sitting back, looking at the CD, feeling like I had just created the greatest musical expression of love in human history. Fun fact, if you use the tap tags in your pews right in front of you, you can find a link to the soundtrack of Teenage Angst that I created just for you. You see, some pastors are going to give you sermon notes on Easter Sunday. I'm going to give you my heart in the form of a dope mixtape. Anyway, then you burn the CD, which took 12 minutes back then, and you just sat there watching the progress bar like your entire life depended on it, because if it skipped, then you had to start all over. And emotionally, I didn't know if I could handle that. Then you grab a Sharpie, you write the songs on the front, you try to make your handwriting look cooler than it actually was, maybe even draw something artistic because the presentation mattered. And when it was all done, you hand it to her. You try to act casual and you say, hey, I made this for you. No big deal. Meanwhile, inside you're like, this is it, this is it, this is it. This is the moment, this is how she'll know. This is how everything changes. Because I genuinely believed that if the soundtrack was right, maybe the moment could change. And that girl who was way out of my league might actually say yes. You see, music has a way of doing that. The soundtrack that can shift the atmosphere. A soundtrack can change emotions. A soundtrack can redefine a moment. And here's the truth. We don't just experience that with songs. We live our lives with soundtracks playing in our minds. Some of us wake up every day with the same soundtrack. We wake up and it says, you're not enough. It's too late. Nothing is ever going to change. This is how it's always going to be. And what Easter reminds us is that resurrection begins when the soundtrack changes. Because 2,000 years ago, the world thought the music had stopped. Jesus was crucified, he was dead, he was buried, silence filled the air, hope was gone, and it looked like death had written the final song. But 3 days later, the King of Kings walked out of the grave. And when the King of Kings stepped into that moment, the soundtrack to our lives changed forever. That's what Easter is really about. It's about a soundtrack changing. Because the truth is, long before we ever created playlists or mixtapes or burned CDs, long before Spotify ever told us what to listen to, there were people already living with soundtracks in their minds. And when you read the resurrection story, you start to realize something, that every person who encountered the resurrection had a soundtrack playing. Mary had a soundtrack. The disciples had a soundtrack. Peter had a soundtrack. And every single one of them walked into Easter carrying the same kind of music. They were all carrying the soundtrack of defeat. You see, Friday had been brutal. Jesus, the one they believed was the king, the one they thought that was going to change everything, the one that they left everything to follow, was now hanging on a cross. And when the king is crucified, when the king dies, hope gets buried with him. The disciples had watched him die. They saw the sky grow dark. They heard his final breath. They watched the stone roll in front of the tomb. And in that moment, the soundtrack changed. The soundtrack became, it's over. We were wrong. Nothing's going to change. The soundtrack became death wins. And here's the thing. When the King of Kings is in a grave, it feels like hope is in the grave too. Because they believed that Jesus was the king, and now the king was gone. And when the king is gone, fear gets louder. When the king is absent from your life, doubt gets louder. When the king is absent from your life, shame gets louder, hopelessness gets louder. And what's amazing is this is exactly where we find these people in the Bible. Mary's walking to the tomb and she's carrying grief. The disciples are hiding behind locked doors, carrying fear. Thomas is wrestling with doubt. Peter is drowning in failure. Every single one of them is living under the soundtrack of defeat in their lives. And what they didn't realize was that on Sunday morning, the King of Kings was about to step into their story. And when the King of Kings steps into your story, the soundtrack changes. Let's start with Mary, because Mary's the first one to experience it. John 20 tells us that on the very first day of the week, while it was still dark, I love that detail, right? I love that detail that Mary goes to the tomb while it was still dark. You see, it was dark outside, but it was dark inside too. Her hope was gone. Her future felt uncertain. Everything she thought that Jesus was going to do, everything she believed he would become, now it all seemed buried behind a stone. Listen to how John describes the moment. He says, "Now on the very first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went early while it was still dark to the tomb and saw the stone was taken away from the tomb." Now here's the thing. Mary's not showing up expecting resurrection. She's not walking to the tomb thinking today is the day that everything changes. No, she's walking with the soundtrack of grief playing in her mind. She's walking to visit the king that she believed was dead. The miracle worker who was gone. The one who had changed her life was now in a grave. And so she arrives and the stone is rolled away. And at first that doesn't bring hope, it just brings more confusion. Because when you're living under the soundtrack of defeat, even good news is hard to recognize. So she assumes that someone has taken Jesus' body. She runs and she tells the disciples she's overwhelmed, she's confused, she's grieving. But eventually Mary finds herself back at the tomb standing there weeping. And so John continues. But Mary was standing outside the tomb weeping. And so as she wept, she stopped and looked into the tomb and she saw two angels in white sitting, one at the head and one at the feet where the body of Jesus had lain. They told her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "Because they've taken away my Lord and I don't know where they've laid him." Mary's overwhelmed. She's grieving. She's stuck in the soundtrack of loss. And then all of a sudden, Jesus is standing right in front of her. But she doesn't recognize him. She doesn't recognize him because sometimes when the soundtrack of despair is playing, you can miss the King of Kings standing right in front of you. And so John writes this. It says, when she had said this, she turned around and she saw Jesus standing and didn't know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Who are you looking for?" She, supposing him to be the gardener, said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." And then I want you to see what Jesus does next, because Jesus does something simple and powerful and incredibly personal. He says her name. Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned to him and said, "Rabboni," which is to say teacher. That's it. One word. And everything changes. Everything changes because when the King of Kings calls your name, your resurrection begins. Right, in that moment, the soundtrack shifts. It shifts from grief to hope. It shifts from despair to joy. It shifts from death to life, because the king she thought was dead is now standing right in front of her. And so here's what I came to tell someone today, that for some of you, the king is calling your name right now. You walked into this space carrying grief. You walked into this space carrying loss. You walked into church this morning carrying disappointment. You walked in stuck in a soundtrack that keeps telling you over and over and over again that it's over and nothing is going to change and that hope is gone. But what you don't realize is the King of Kings is standing closer than you think. And just like Mary, he is calling you out of the soundtrack of grief. He's calling you out of the soundtrack of despair. He's calling you out of the soundtrack of defeat. And he's calling you into resurrection and new life. Because when the King of Kings calls your name, the soundtrack changes. And when the soundtrack changes, resurrection begins. Mary wasn't the only one living under the soundtrack of defeat. The disciples were too. You see, while Mary is at the tomb, the disciples weren't out looking for hope. They're hiding. They're not experiencing resurrection. They're expecting danger. Because when the king was crucified, they assumed they're going to be next. And so uncertainty filled the room. The same men who had walked boldly with Jesus were now sitting quietly behind locked doors, trying to figure out what to do next. John tells us exactly where they were and what they were feeling. He writes this. He says, "When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and when the doors were locked where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood in the middle and said to them, 'Peace be with you.'" Now there's a detail there that I want to point out. The doors were locked. Right? That tells you everything you need to know about their mindset. The disciples weren't just discouraged, they were afraid. It says the doors were locked. Why? For fear of the Jewish leaders. Their soundtrack sounded like defeat. It sounded like this. It says, "We messed up. We failed him. It's over. We're next." And honestly, you can understand why. These are men who had left everything to follow Jesus. They believed that he was the king. They believed that he would change everything. But now he's dead and buried, and their hope is buried with him. The future they imagined was gone, and all that remained was fear and uncertainty. And here's what I love about this moment. The disciples don't go looking for Jesus. Jesus comes looking for them. Right? The disciples are hiding behind locked doors, and the King of Kings steps into the room anyway. Fear doesn't stop the King of Kings. Amen. Failure doesn't stop the King of Kings. Amen. He walks right into their fear. He walks right into their failure. He walks right into their doubt. He walks right into their defeat. And the first words he speaks are simply this. He says, "Peace be with you." Amen. When John continues, he said this. He said, when he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. The disciples therefore were glad when they saw the Lord. Jesus therefore said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father sent me, even so I send you." You see, in an instant, the soundtrack changed. They went from fear to joy. They're glad to see Jesus, yes, but then something deeper happens. They go from hiding to purpose. They go from defeat to mission. The same men who were locked in a room because of their fear, Jesus is now sending out with purpose. Why? Because when the King of Kings steps into the room, everything changes. And maybe that's where some of you are today. Not physically behind locked doors, but emotionally behind locked doors, or spiritually behind locked doors, or mentally. You've locked things down. You've been living guarded. You've been carrying fear. You've been holding on to disappointment. You're convinced that things can't change for you. Here's what I want to say. Easter reminds us that the King of Kings walks through locked doors. He steps into fear. He steps into uncertainty. He steps into the places we try to hide. And when he does, the soundtrack shifts. Fear gives way to peace. Uncertainty gives way to purpose. And what felt like defeat becomes the beginning of resurrection. So we've got Mary, right? She's got this soundtrack of grief. And we've got the disciples. They've got this soundtrack of fear. And then there's Peter. And if anyone ever understood the soundtrack of failure in their life, it's Peter. Because Peter hadn't just watched Jesus die. He denied even knowing the dude. 3 times. The same Peter who once boldly declared he would never leave Jesus' side stood around a fire telling people, I don't even know him. And when the rooster crowed, everything changed. Peter's soundtrack in his life just became failure. I blew it. I went too far. Man, I don't know if there's any coming back from this. And so when we find Peter after the resurrection, he's back to fishing. He's back to what Jesus did, or back to what he did before Jesus called him to do something else. Because that's what failure does in our lives. It convinces us we have to go backward. So he fishes all night and he catches nothing. And then the morning comes and Jesus appears on the shore and the nets fill again. And Peter realizes it's him. And when Peter realizes it's Jesus, he doesn't even wait for the boat. My dude, he takes off his clothes and he just jumps into the water. I'm just sweaty. That's why I did that. Man, I'm dying. Because deep down, Peter still wants restoration. He just doesn't know if it's possible. And when Peter gets to the shore, Jesus is already standing there, cooking breakfast. The King of Kings is opening up a Denny's right on the beach. Right? Cooking breakfast for the man who failed him. And in that moment, everything changes. In John 21, we read this. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord. He said, you know that I love you. Jesus says, feed my sheep. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John. He's talking to Peter. He says, do you love me? And Peter answers, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus says, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter's hurt because Jesus asked him the third time and he says, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. 3 times Jesus asked. 3 times Peter denied. Right, 3 restorations. Peter walked onto that beach carrying the soundtrack of failure and walked away carrying the soundtrack of calling. Yes. The man who thought he was disqualified is now being commissioned by Jesus to go do the work of the church. The man who thought he blew it was now being sent forward because when the King of Kings restores you, yes, failure loses its power. And maybe that's where some of us are. Maybe we've been replaying our mistakes. We've been rehearsing our regrets. We've convinced ourselves that we went too far. You don't know how bad I messed up, Dan. Here's what I do know. Easter reminds us that the King of Kings doesn't just forgive failure. He resurrects purpose out of failure. Mary's stuck in grief until the King of Kings calls her name. The disciples are stuck in fear until the King of Kings steps into the room. Peter is stuck in failure until the King of Kings restores his calling. And suddenly, when you look at the resurrection story, you start to see the pattern that resurrection in our lives happens when the King of Kings steps into the story. The soundtrack changes when the King of Kings steps in. Because that's what Easter is. Easter is not just a moment in history. Easter is an invitation into resurrection. Yes. Maybe that's exactly where some people are today. Some of us walked into this room carrying the soundtrack of grief. You lost someone. You lost something. A relationship ended. A dream didn't work out. A season of life closed. And you've been walking around with that quiet weight ever since. And the soundtrack keeps telling you it's over. Don't you know nothing's ever going to feel the same again? Some of us live every day in the soundtrack of fear. Fear about your future. Fear about your family. Fear about your health. Fear about what comes next in your life. And you've been stuck behind locked doors, emotionally and spiritually, and it feels like you're just trying to protect yourself. Some of us are carrying the burden of the soundtrack of failure. You replay the mistakes. You rehearse the regrets in your mind over and over again. There are things I wish that I could undo. There's words I wish I could take back. There's choices I wish I never made. And the soundtrack keeps saying, you've gone too far, Dan. You're disqualified, Dan. You blew it, Dan. Some of us are living with a soundtrack of doubt. Maybe you're here this morning and you want to believe, but you're not sure anymore. Life's been hard, and prayers have felt unanswered, and circumstances didn't turn out the way you hoped. And now you're wondering, and you're sitting here wondering, is resurrection even possible for me? Some of us are stuck in the soundtrack of emptiness. Everything looks fine on the outside, but inside you just know that something's missing. And so you've tried all sorts of different things to fill that. You've tried success, and you've tried achievement, and you've tried relationships, and you've tried distractions, but nothing ever seems to fill the space. And so what Easter does is Easter steps into all of it. Because Easter is the moment when the King of Kings walks into death and walks out with life. You see, the grave couldn't hold him. Death couldn't silence him. Darkness couldn't stop him. And when the King of Kings walked out of the grave, he didn't just change history. When the King of Kings walks out of the grave, what he does is he makes resurrection possible for me and you. Amen. Which means this: my grief doesn't get the final word. My fear doesn't get the final word. My failure doesn't get the final word. My doubt doesn't get the final word. The only emptiness that has power over my life is the empty tomb on a Sunday morning. You see, the King of Kings is still stepping into stories. He's still calling names. He's still walking through locked doors. He's still restoring failures. He's still bringing resurrection. And maybe today, the King of Kings is standing closer than you think, ready to change the soundtrack of your life. Because when the King of Kings steps in, hope rises. When the King of Kings steps in, fear fades. When the King of Kings steps in, purpose returns. When the King of Kings steps in, resurrection in my life begins. And so the question of Easter isn't just, did Jesus rise from the dead? The question of Easter is, are you going to make space in your life for the King of Kings to change the soundtrack of your life? Will you pray with me? So this morning, God, we just come to you, and we acknowledge that we carry so much, God. And we celebrate this morning. We celebrate that we can stand in this room and encounter the King of Kings. We celebrate that we can stand in this room and declare boldly that today is my rock bottom. I will get no lower than this, God, because I'm going to encounter you right now. I'm going to make room in my life right now because I know the King is coming. And I know when the King steps into my life, everything changes. In your holy and mighty and all-powerful name, we join with the angels in heaven and say amen. Amen.